Club. Thank you for coming this evening. Before I hand over to Paddy O'Connell, who will chair this evening's event, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Over to Paddy.
Thanks, Millie. Hello, welcome, friends, rivals. We were just remembering that Millie called Marie Colvin a year and 2 weeks ago to ask her to come to the Frontline Club for this event. And she said, well, I will, delighted. And she said, remember, what you're doing at the Frontline Club talking about Syria is almost as important as what we're doing here trying to report it, because it does slip out so easily of the headlines. So with that in mind, it's an amazing turnout from all of us here tonight. And thank you very much for coming. It's a public meeting, so we will be very quickly coming to you in the audience. To make it easier, would you kindly theme your remarks? We'll come to the Syrian National Council last. We'll come to the regional players in the 20 minutes before that. We'll do the West before that, but we'll start with two questions. One about the UK's new sending of armoured vehicles and John Kerry. But first, could I ask the panel to introduce themselves with a brief paragraph about yourself, Julian, and what you most want us to leave the room knowing you think or fear.
Great. Julian Barnes-Stacey, I'm with the European Council on Foreign Relations, but was previously based in Damascus for 3 years as a journalist. In terms of what I think, I don't think there's a military solution. I think that the price of a military solution is the destruction of Syria, and that, to be honest, talk of I don't think there's been real effort into a genuine attempt at a political solution. I think there's a delusion about what we're talking about.
Good evening, my name is Sakha Al-Mahdi. I'm a broadcast journalist. I've been covering Syria for the last decade, started in 2002 when Syria was a very, very different country. I'm really sick and tired of the navel-gazing over whether to arm the rebels or not, and the fact that the focus has really been taken away from the humanitarian crisis that is befalling Syria. 1 million refugees today, 2 to 4 million internally displaced persons, and the fact that Saudi, the UAE and Kuwait have broken their promise to fund this UN appeal with $300 million each, and the fact that we're talking about the war rather than the humanitarian crisis.
My name is Reem Turkmani. I'm astrophysicist at the Imperial College. However, since the uprising started, I devoted my time to Syria, being very politically active. I founded a group with my colleagues in Syria, a political group called Building the Syrian State. We strongly believe in finding a political solution to the crisis. Despite everything happened, we still believe this crisis is going to be determined by a political solution. And we don't think that the international community is doing enough to support its claim that it wants a political solution. It says something and it does something else. And in that, we see most parties as guilty, like Russia is as guilty as the US, because if they all decide to agree with each other and not using Syria as an arena for proxy war, then there will be a political solution in Syria and the bloodshed.
Thank you. And can you all hear at the back? Yes, fine.
Yeah, my name is Firas Abi Ali. I work for a risk consulting and forecasting firm called Exclusive Analysis. What I would say about this is that, firstly, there is no such thing as an international community. There are different states with different interests. The prospect of political settlement of Syria is highly unrealistic at this stage and will continue to be so. The risk of the war in Syria spreading to Lebanon and Iraq is severe and only rising. And I think that this is going to be what ends up happening next going forward.
Thank you very much. We can all go home now, ladies and gentlemen. we know what the panel think, and it's your turn in just a second. So as we sit down, Britain is sending armoured vehicles, body armour, trash incinerators. Hooray! What's all your reaction? And we'll come to you in the audience on the British news today. Julian first. Hooray?
I think it's insignificant. It's an attempt to begin a conversation with the opposition, but it won't really have any impact on the ground, and it certainly won't change the calculus of Assad or those fighting on the more radical end of the spectrum.
Because some MPs have said it's our hand getting dragged into the mangle.
Well, I don't think a few kind of 4x4s and some bulletproof jackets are really going to make. I mean, I think there's a big jump between that and providing weapons. I mean, the more important thing is this message of the US indirectly supporting arms going into the country. I think the UK is much more removed And I don't think, I mean, what's significant is they've begun a direct conversation with the opposition.
On the UK, does anyone on the panel disagree with Julian, who thinks this is significant?
I don't disagree. I would add the following. The growing perception that the West is supporting the arming of the opposition makes it a lot more likely that assets belonging to countries that are backing the opposition in this manner will be attacked in places like Iraq and Lebanon. That would be the point that I would highlight.
Grim?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like throwing breadcrumbs to the armed opposition, it really doesn't mean that they are backing the armed option. Otherwise, we would have seen them supporting them, with different type of weapon. They're still talking about a political solution, but they want the political solution that suits them. So they have to keep the armed groups quiet and happy for a while.
It's too little, too late. I mean, the Western reaction to what's happening in Syria, especially the US and the UK, has always been about 5 or 6 months behind Syrian public opinion. It's always been, following on from what they've been calling for. So, the US was very, very slow in calling for Assad to step down. It's been very slow in supplying aid, and now the UK is very slow in supplying any kind of support to the armed opposition.
So the panel are sniffy about the announcement from the Foreign Secretary. Is anyone in the room interested? Do they think it's significant to send armed vehicles, body armour? There's a gentleman at the front. You think it's significant? Well, can we bring the microphone down here? And just on this news today, he stood up in Parliament. He said we're going to get involved. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely been a change in the direction and in the amplification of what's going on from the West towards Syria. And if you notice, it always goes in waves. It starts off with it started off in 2 years ago with very simple statements, and then you get a period of quiet, and then after that you start to see a bit more cautious kind of toe dipping into the water, and then something a little bit more. And I think what's happening is you're seeing a slow escalation after periods of quiet. So we could see another period of quiet for 2 months, maybe in May. And then we'll start seeing them saying, well, now we're going to take this to another level.
So is this significant from the UK?
I think so, yes.
So, I mean, this gentleman...
I think he's right. I think it points to the trajectory of where things are going, and I think that we are drip feeding more and more, and eventually you'll see an escalation. But, I mean, whether this in and of itself is symbolic, I don't think so. I mean, Hague's made this big deal about how this is a transformation of the British position, the EU sanctions have been relaxed. Today, does it make a difference on the ground? I don't think so.
You're right in implying that this is the beginning of a slippery slope, because it is, because the only thing we've been talking about in relation to Syria up till now is this kind of militarization. We've been militarizing public opinion in the West, and the only option is now whether to arm or whether not to arm, or how to get weapons to the rebels, or who should get the arms in the rebels. We haven't been talking about a political solution, and there are obvious reasons, because Bashar al-Assad has been incredibly insincere in any attempt at finding a political solution. But what about on the international scale? What about bringing Russia and China, banging their heads together? Because, there is an EU arms embargo. If you could get Russia and China to sign up to that, then that's part of the solution.
Explain to me the physics of banging the heads of Russia and China together.
That's next week's session. Book now.
I mean, I think that if there is a trend that is emerging here that involves actually beginning to arm the Syrian opposition, it will be reversed as more of the excesses of this opposition are revealed. Let's be clear about this. A lot of the parts that currently constitute the armed opposition in Syria are just as bad, if not worse, than the Syrian government. I'm talking here about people like Jabhat al-Nusra and Liwa al-Islam and all of these characters who believe in beheadings as a solution to political problems.
It's coming to you in the room one day, but the Foreign Secretary said he's doing this precisely because there is jihadism creeping into the opposition.
Well, unless he actually provides them with serious weaponry combined with training and spends a lot more on that and takes a lot more time to commit to that, all he's doing is provoking them.
So the sending a few Land Rovers is provoking Islamists.
I mean, do you see it as changing the
He does. He's given a statement saying we step in now to help the right guys rather than just...
He's wrong.
He's wrong.
I disagree with you. I think the UK carefully selected its support that it classify more as self-defense, not as aggression. And I don't see this as a developing trend, because there is a much faster developing trend, which is the growth of the violence in Syria and the spillage over the border to the countries around. And I think it's this violence that provides an environment for the extremism to grow, not anything
Question
else.
at the back on the UK. This is on the UK's involvement. If you can keep it to that, otherwise I'll come back to you.
Paddy, the UK doesn't have a foreign policy vis-à-vis Middle East anymore.
Use the microphone, sir.
We only follow what is handed down to us from Washington D.C. So for us to start speculating on where our policy is aimed at is pointless. But we must not forget that this is no more a classic revolution against a dictatorial regime. It is now a struggle between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam.
Okay, and we'll come to sectarianism. Give the microphone to this gentleman here on the UK's involvement.
Yeah, I just wondered if any of your panelists would be happy to drive around in one of these armoured vehicles in northern Syria right now. It seems to me that you'd be lit up like a target for any regime planes.
Absolutely.
They haven't got the precision bombs that would allow them to target a specific vehicle.
But I think the gentleman before raises an important point that it's hard to really know what the British policy is, because they talk about wanting to support a political solution. Meanwhile, we're seeing this escalation in terms of providing support for the armed opposition, and this continued talk of a zero-sum result that the political solution for the West, for the UK government at the moment, is Assad goes, the opposition win, that's it. I mean, that's not a political solution, that's not a political negotiation, that's an imposed solution on the regime. And so I think there's this kind of tension there between what the result is and what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to get there.
Yeah, I agree there is no UK Middle East policy, but I don't see there is a US one as well. I think the changes in the region, not only in Syria, all across the region have taken everybody by surprise, the region itself and also the West, and nobody have been ready to produce an entirely new policy towards the Middle East.
Okay.
But I disagree that it's a sectarian conflict.
We're coming to sectarianism at the end. So on the UK announcement today, is anyone wanting to make another comment before I move us on? Everyone is dismissing it. Only one person in the room thinks it's significant. In Parliament, those people said it is. It's us getting involved. But the mood of the meeting is, doesn't matter to me, send my Land Rover.
I think it's insignificant in the sense that it's a pitiful contribution. But I think making a pitiful contribution is significant. Because what you're doing is the British government is aligning themselves to a certain group of the resistance and adding fuel to Bashar al-Assad's argument that the resistance is a foreign concept, a Western-fueled exercise. So I think it's significant in the sense that it can only do harm, but it's an insignificant contribution.
So you think it's harmful, the contribution?
I would disagree slightly. I mean, I think if you save some lives with bulletproof jackets, that's no bad thing. I don't think Assad needs extra fuel to believe that this is a foreign conspiracy against him.
And to the gentleman at the back, this is about the UK. I think you've just come in, so we don't want anything else.
Yes, indeed. I would just say I would imagine it could very well be significant, just simply on the grounds of a walk of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. This is symbolism, but symbolism can sometimes be important, and it may be the first step on beyond symbolism. Thank you.
I think, yeah, it could be. It could be something bigger than this. On your point about whether this is, symptomatic of Syrian attempts to brand it as a foreign conspiracy. Well, it's 2 years too late to do that. It's a Syrian struggle, and the Syrian revolutionaries are very keen to keep it a domestic struggle and not to have it hijacked by the international community. So I don't think that's a risk.
We're talking about the Syrian rebels who are getting armed from abroad, who are very keen about keeping it a Syrian struggle. Yeah. And the Syrian government that is getting armed from abroad, that is very keen on keeping it a Syrian struggle.
Go on.
No, I think the political players.
Made my point.
Okay, I think the political players, mainly the opposition that is inside Syria, it's very keen on keeping it as a Syrian conflict. I have to say something. You can only practice politics inside the very same society you want to rule. So I don't believe any of the external opposition. I don't even call myself as a external opposition. I support mainly a political group that is inside Syria. They are the only ones who have the right to decide the future of their country. I can't sit here and support a solution that includes throwing bombs on them while they're living in that country.
And just before we leave this, Saka, I think you're being told that you've got a rather naive analysis because it is happening as we speak. internationalisation of the conflict, armed from abroad, Russians, Chinese, Iranians, British, and you're saying it's all Syrian, it's a Syrian affair.
Well, the Syrian revolution, the Syrian uprising is still very Syrian, and they have, they've kept foreign donors and foreign supporters at arm's length, and it took a long time before they were able to get those foreign arms in.
I think if you follow the social media pages of the Syrian opposition, you will see a very clear trend here, whereby the conflict has become a lot more sectarian. The initial people who started this uprising, which was indeed a secular and peaceful uprising that wanted democracy, have pretty much all been sidelined or turned into militants themselves. You regularly see videos of people who had been peaceful activists now carrying guns. I think that the notion that this initial Syrian uprising has survived and continues to survive to this day applies only to a very small minority of Syrian activists, whereas the vast majority of society has shifted towards the military option.
Of course it
Not
has.
the society. Not the society. No, it's not the society.
Let
It's
Saka
extremely
answer.
important.
He was first.
Of course, it's changed form and changed shape out of self-defense, because the peaceful demonstrators were being bombed from the sky and being sniped across the country. So it's changed form. But in terms of whether it's a foreign conspiracy or whether it's a foreign-supported revolution or not, that's only been very, very recently. Look at where the heavy arms have been coming in, when they came in. This hasn't been happening for 2 years, and they've been using small arms that they've captured from the Syrian army. This is a new development.
Exactly. And the people who have been most successful at capturing heavy weaponry from the Syrian army have been the jihadis, who have been supported by foreign jihadis who have entered Syria. These are the people who are quite keen on keeping it localized to an extent, in addition to making sure that their networks of backers in the Gulf continue supporting them financially.
Exactly, they're the main beneficiaries of Gulf support.
But they're the ones who are actually counting on their own resources to do this. The rest are not.
And we're moving on now to talk about the US. But despite what you say, the Foreign Secretary agrees with your analysis and says, if we come in with a British hand played now, we can stop this jihadi movement spreading. And you say,
might have
no.
a point if he was providing something meaningful. What is being discussed right now is not meaningful.
I disagree. I mean, I think even if you supply meaningful supplies, maybe you get lucky, maybe you don't. I mean, where have we got examples of providing significant support arms and then 5 years later having that country align with our interests or the groups that we want? I mean, it's a naive... I mean, yes, in the short term we can buy allegiance, but that will last a day or two once this is over.
It didn't work well in Benghazi, did it?
Didn't work well in Benghazi. I mean, in Iraq, how many troops were there? A few 100,000? Look at it.
Right, so I saw difference of opinion on the UK involvement. The question that you all kindly came for tonight was to hear, will or can John Kerry, the new Secretary of State, deliver on his promise not to leave the Syrian opposition dangling in the wind? So we're on to the US, which our friend says is basically pulling the strings to the UK. Can it pull the strings in Syria? The whole panel, and then to you in the room, starting with you this time, Saka.
No, it's trying to salvage its reputation and no more. I think the US would be very keen for this war of attrition to continue indefinitely, because that means two things. You'll end up with a very weakened state, whatever state emerges, and you'll have plenty of reconstruction contract opportunities for the US to come and sort out when it's all over. And the fact is, America started this war, this revolution, with credit. It had a good reputation. Obama was supported. He had fans among the Syrian people, and there were Syrians who were counting on him. Ambassador Robert Ford went up to Hama, and he was greeted with cheers and with crowds. It just went on too long, and the Syrians were left dangling for far too long. They received nothing in terms of military support. They received nothing in terms of humanitarian support, or very little in terms of humanitarian support. And yes, it's trying to salvage its reputation, and now I'm afraid that whatever they do will be seen as hijacking the revolution.
You, Rim.
Oh, sorry. No, I don't think it's trying to salvage its reputation. Really, is just looking at to guard its own interest. Just as it started. I still don't think they're doing enough to support a political solution. They keep talking about a political solution, but you can't support political solution, which is a peaceful solution. I'm talking here about a solution. I'm not talking about peaceful demonstrations. I'm talking about a solution. Peaceful solutions means reaching peace, and you can only reach peace with peaceful means. So you can't talk about arming the rebels and peaceful political solution at the same time. They will rescue their reputation only if they have serious talks with the Russians, I think, and agreeing a solution. Because now most of the Syrians, I mean, we're talking a lot about the armed rebels and the regime, but I want to think about the Syrians in the middle, those who are stuck in the middle. Right now, they believe their blood is on the hands of the international community, the US and Russia, both.
Are you telling us that you want talks between the US and the Russians?
Yes.
So Syria, like an old style, like Czechoslovakia, really, something. It's a state for the Russians and the Americans to decide about.
No, it is now an international conflict. The root of this conflict are all in Syria. It started as Syrian conflict with social, political, sectarian, deeply historic roots. Okay, it's completely justified conflict. However, right now it has been internationalized. There are international interests, and if they don't sort out their matters, I don't see this conflict being resolved.
So your answer to the question, can Kerry deliver on his promise not to leave the Syrian opposition dangling in the wind, is yes, if he has face-to-face talks with the Russians?
Yes.
Say that if you were looking for the Americans to be able to influence this person, then John Kerry, this issue, then John Kerry is the wrong person. Chuck Hagel, the Secretary of Defense, might be the right person. If you're looking at a situation in which the Americans choose to train, arm, and impose some sort of no-flight zone over Syria, yes, they can influence this. Anything short of that, no, this is not serious.
And do you support a no-fly zone enforced by the Americans?
I have no opinion on this. I don't support any suggested policy. I'm just giving you my analysis of the possible policies.
Right, but you raised it out, you know. You raised the policy you don't support.
You asked, can the Americans deliver? I told you they can deliver if.
I think the American role is very significant. I mean, I think that where the US goes, Europe will go after it, and I think that the French and the British and others have been waiting for an American lead on this for a long time. I think the key development of the last few weeks is the fact that the Americans have started working with the Saudis to get in arms via Jordan. You have reports of them training rebels in Jordan, in camps there. So, I mean, the Americans are moving forward, and I think they are getting more engaged. Whether this will be productive, no, I don't think they're going to leave them dangling in the wind. But whether this is going to be productive, whether this will actually help de-escalate, I'm very skeptical. I mean, I think it's a question of Russia, but I think the other key question here is Iran. And
we're not talking about Iran. On Kerry,
I think the US has to engage. There has to be engagement. The Iranians have to be brought into this mix if there is to be de-escalation. And the Americans have blacklisted that. They're the reason that that Annan was not able to bring the Iranians into the discussion at Geneva.
The US is almost becoming irrelevant in this because Saudi and Qatar have been arming the rebels for months, and, you know, or possibly longer than months. If the US was to take a lead on this and do something about it, it would just mean that Saudi and Qatar could do it out in the open instead of, you know, hiding behind head teachers' back.
I agree.
But no fly zone, though. No, but not having that.
You're asking me as though it was my decision. If you give me a policy, I can analyze its implications for you.
But we've now reached the point where you're now telling us that the US, the panel is telling us the US has no influence. One member of the panel wants face-to-face talks with the Russians. You're saying they're irrelevant.
I don't see what are they going to talk about.
Well, what do you think they should talk about?
I think the only point of talking to the Russians and the Iranians and all of these is if you're prepared to engage in real political negotiations as opposed to a political imposed deal. You may not like that, and it may not be the right path. So, you know, perhaps we decide that removing Assad and the regime root and branch is more important. But if your aim is for some kind of political solution, I think you have to talk to the Russians, the Iranians, those backing the regime, because the only possible way of, I think, trying to de-escalate is, I mean, Assad is not going to do it unilaterally. We know that. End of story. So I think the only possible optimistic way is if his external backers basically squeeze him and say, look, end of story. And the only reason they're going to do that is if they feel that they have a stake and this isn't a Western US imposed deal.
Can I say a couple of things about this political solution issue? Firstly, if you're going to have the opposition negotiating, who speaks for the opposition? If anybody tries to actually sit down and say that they represent the opposition, They will not be able to, because none of the opposition that is being spoken to has any control over the militants on the ground. I think the key indicator that we have to look at here is who tried to kill George Sabra. George Sabra is the head of the Syrian National Council. Somebody tried to blow up his convoy on the Turkish-Syrian border. The SNC itself did not accuse the Syrian government. The implication was that the jihadis in Syria tried to kill him. If the jihadis in Syria, without the Syrians, without the opposition trying to negotiate, are willing to kill what the internationally recognized representative of the opposition, what prospect is there really for a negotiated settlement? Okay. Hold on. This is on the opposition side. On the Alawi side, on the Syrian government side, the Alawis see this as a fight to the finish, and increasingly rightly so. The people who they are fighting are increasingly people who want to behead them, force them out of the country, eliminate them in some way or form, make sure that they have got zero political representation. If Bashar al-Assad were to try to negotiate with these people and sacrifice some of the leaders around him, those leaders around him will get rid of him first and continue that war.
Surely it's the other way around. Surely the Alawite population is being held hostage by Assad. Surely actually a path out for them is a good way forward.
A year ago.
I still believe that's true. I mean, it's getting ever more desperate. I mean, I agree, it's existential. They will fight to the end if they have no other choice.
Military point of view.
But I think that you have, if they are offered something, it's more Assad whose neck is on the line, who's threatened and unwilling to cut a deal. I agree with you on the opposition front. How do you get these different militant groups who are quite happy to fight to the end to also engage in a political track? It's very hard and it's very unlikely. But if you're not prepared to create these openings and you work towards that, then what hope do you have?
I don't understand what you actually mean by opening. This is a rather vague word.
In that case, we'll come back to this cul-de-sac. Okay, it's very interesting.
But it's very important that he asked the question, who is going to negotiate with you?
And I want to come to that. It's a section at the end, all on its own. So the question of John Kerry, to you in the room now, do you feel that the US is irrelevant? Do you feel Kerry can deliver on his promise not to leave them dangling in the wind? Does anyone want to come in on the question of yes? No, you've had one, sorry. So the question of, yes, sir. The question of the Americans, dismissed as irrelevant by the panel, arguably a superpower in the eyes of some people in the room. But over to you, sir.
As a journalist who covered both Iraq and Libya for American television, I think that obviously, I think that the lessons that we all know that were learned from Iraq and that were practiced in Libya is that the U.S. doesn't have the political will to own wars and victories anymore. And that Libya, in a scramble that Sarkozy created, this air war solution, that I was in Baghdad just after Baghdad fell. I was in Libya when Tripoli fell. And the difference is a very profound one, because for all the problems Libya faces today, there was a profound sense that the Libyans owned their victory. There was never that sense in Iraq. And so when you add that to the absolute repulsion in America to owning another war, getting troops on the ground, I think Kerry's hands are very much tied.
So he can't deliver on his promise?
I think that this talk, I'm not quite sure what the Russians would talk about with the Americans either. I think it's a very interesting question. But I think in a material sense, they can drip, drip, drip. But this is so much bigger than Libya, and my sense is that it's so much more volatile. To me, it seems like a Balkans on steroids, and so I think there aren't simple. Libya was a contained, relatively speaking, problem.
I think the Americans learned a very hard lesson from Libya and Baghdad and Iraq, that they're pushing or supporting one side of the society to win over the other one means dividing this country between winners and losers. So when the war ends, you've got these winners and losers, and one part will be resented by the other, and you leave them with long, scars and no post-crisis, no preparation for the post-crisis phase. And we see results in Iraq right now. This is why I think Kerry very carefully said when he was in Turkey, he did not say we want to support the opposition. He said we want to support the Syrian people, and we want to support the opposition to find a solution, not to win. I don't think they want the opposition to win. A solution is for everyone. A victory is only for one side over the other. I want a solution.
So can I ask what the US and the UK should be doing in this section now? What should the US and UK be doing? Let's do 5 or 10 minutes on that, and then we'll come to regional players. Obviously, that's difficult for you because you don't want to actually posit, but you know you can raise an eyebrow, or you know, depending, or come in. But Julian, you're in charge. What would you do today as the US or the UK, if you want to make a distinction?
I think you would pump in hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of humanitarian aid, first and foremost. I think that both through the NGOs working in Damascus, but via Jordan, via Turkey, I mean, I think there's a huge need there. And it's a sad reflection of the lack of international commitment to kind of Syrian people, the needs are not being met there. In terms of solving the crisis, I mean, as I say, it's hard, it's difficult. There probably isn't a solution. And I think until the two sides are willing to engage in a political solution, it's hard to imagine otherwise.
Are you supplying weapons?
No, you're not. I think there are enough weapons. I mean, they don't need weapons.
They say they do. The Syrian
of course they do, because they want complete victory. I don't believe a complete victory is possible. So my policy proposal would be that actually, as I say,
bananas, not bazookas. You're going to give them bananas,
but that's not the crucial. You do that, yes, but the crucial ingredient here is you engage in a real political track, and that means you stop saying that our preconditions for a political transition are Assad and the regime must go, X, Y, Z, and must happen, and then it's a political solution. That's not a political solution, that's a political victory. You say, yes, we're prepared to engage in negotiations, we're not going to impose preconditions on that. That's the only way to get the regime backers, including the Russians and the Iranians, into the room. It's the only potential way to try and squeeze Assad and to get him moving. It probably won't work, but you're looking at such a dire solution. I think that's the only prospect of trying to create that diplomatic political space that may create an opening.
I think it's interesting that we've all given up on any kind of prospect of Assad talking. There are going to be no negotiations whatsoever with Bashar al-Assad because he's been so insincere, because he's broken his promises, because he hasn't talked, he hasn't followed through on the promises that he's made to international negotiators, and so we're all talking about negotiations in the international community. If there are to be any negotiations, this is where they need to happen. What should the UK and the US do? Well, yeah, the answer is pour in humanitarian aid. You know, there's a massive shortfall. There's a couple of $100 million that the UN has received for the first 6 months of this year. It needs $1.5 billion at the very minimum to meet the needs of those refugees.
Do you want a no-fly zone?
No, because a no-fly zone means war. You either do it one way or the other. You don't, supply. Well, it means a UK, US, NATO, Western-led war in Syria, and that's a very different situation to what's going on now.
And you don't want weapons sent to the opposition?
Well, you either supply weapons, the heavy weaponry that is needed to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. I personally don't support the continued militarization of the war, but if you're going to do it properly, send in enough weapons to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, or don't do it at all, and support a political negotiation. Don't sit on the fence and do neither, because that's just going to prolong the war and continue this war of attrition, and more Syrians are going to die, and there is going to be no solution to the war.
Enforce a safety corridor?
No, because that also means a war. It means...
How else do you deliver the humanitarian aid?
It's being delivered by the UN now. It's not a problem of delivery, although there are problems of delivery.
So you propose making refugee camps bigger?
I propose supporting the UN in delivering its aid within Syria right now, and it's doing an incredibly good job.
If you're going to talk about a realistic political solution, firstly, the idea of delivering aid, there's the practicalities of it, which is that you've got people in Syria who are willing to kill any aid workers that go in because they are taking away their own political credibility, first. Secondly, if you're going to talk a political solution, you have two options here. Either federalism, and that would probably involve an exchange of populations, which is a very unpleasant prospect.
No one's talking about federalism. The Syrian people have dismissed this idea.
Realistically speaking, it would either involve a democratic country where the people who are responsible for the violence are put on trial, highly unrealistic, or it would involve partitioning the country into a federal state or into actually separate independent states.
No one is talking about partition at the moment, within Syria or without Syria. No one is talking about partition. It's a fear that's raised by Bashar al-Assad to scare people away from any kind of support.
If I was the UK or the US, I would go back to Geneva Communique signed in June last year, because this was...
a lot of good has happened since June last year.
Yes,
we're up to 1 million refugees now. So what do you want? Is it 2 million more? 2 million?
And this is exactly what the Prince of Qatar and Kerry said.
We're coming to Qatar. What would you do as the US and the UK?
Yes, I would go back to Geneva because despite all the changes, the essence is still the same. You have to talk about a negotiated political solution, and all these countries committed themselves in that Geneva communique not to escalate the armed option because it's leading to increased violence and increased need of aid. So
what would you do? You're in charge.
Yes.
You get on an aeroplane to Geneva. Is that what you do?
No. If I'm in charge, where?
You're the US and the UK. Our friend says it's the same. What would you do?
I would first negotiate with my international opponents, with China and Russia and Iran.
You're all about negotiating with everybody else, aren't you?
I would like to hear in some detail from the people who are proposing negotiations, what are the topics that are going to be discussed?
No killing.
Can I not, with the regime?
With whoever it is that you're proposing negotiations with.
Okay, if it's with the regime, I want to take the authorities of the president out of him.
Okay.
That's the main, and the authorities have to be in the hand of a coalition government or coalition body, whatever that rules the country. And then all this extreme power that he has to manipulate the army and the security forces, you can use it to...
And what do we do about our previous problem that we identified and we agreed on? That nobody speaks for the opposition, that the opposition would attempt to undermine any political settlement.
Okay,
but the opposition...
Can I speak
Let
about
Rim
this?
finish.
Okay, first of all, I'm very disappointed here that we're only talking about the armed rebels as if this is only a conflict between not few, of course, between the fighting brigades and the Syrian regime.
We saw what happened to the
This started as a Syrian conflict, has social deep roots. It's about rights and freedoms and dignity and many, many other issues. And it's going to remain as such. So I want to go back to the Syrian people and who represents the Syrian people. There isn't one body that represents them, not the regime, not the coalition, nobody else. So if there are going to be negotiations, I think the first step has to be that a mediator, independent mediator, have to crystallize the parties to this conflict. There will be, of course, the armed opposition and the political opposition, different groups, not just one. Most of them are inside Syria. Put them all on one side, have one clear political plan, and then they can negotiate with the regime.
So we're coming to the room next on what should the US and the UK do after you, Julian.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, if you're going to make a political solution work, which, I mean, to a certain degree, Assad wins in the short term. I mean, you can't get around that. That is the price that one would have to pay for the country not falling into utter destruction, in the sense that him and his allies are given a stake at the table.
Sorry, there's no need to stop. If you just put your hand up, we brought the whole room to a halt. Well done. What a powerful... You should run everything. You run everything. Right, your point on the US and the UK.
No, I just wanted to intervene a little bit because I thought it was very interesting that 2 or 3 of the panelists in their responses talked about ramping up humanitarian aid as one of the very first things that they would do. So in fact, I'm going to pass this over to my boss here.
If this is a plug, I'm leaving.
No, it's not a plug.
I'm leaving. So the question we're all in here to ask is what the US and the UK should do. So
okay, but in response to the question of how we should organise humanitarian assistance, I think for the moment
we can't hear you. I'm sorry either.
For the moment, we have to recognise that the humanitarian assistance going into Syria is pretty marginal. It's a drop in the ocean. Very little is actually being done compared to other major humanitarian crises. The deployment is pitiful. I think we can all agree for those of us who've been inside Syria. Secondly, a lot of the aid assistance is being the control exerted by Damascus is limiting the assistance on the government side, controlling the quantities, the destinations, the timing, etc., which means that aid delivery is incredibly difficult. And also on the opposition side, there is insufficient care provided to protecting or letting aid flow freely. But there's another problem. The UN system today is only working on one side of the conflict. It's working in the side that's authorized by Damascus on the government side. The UN system should ramp up its assistance and work in opposition-controlled areas where there's increasing territory and increasing numbers of people who are not receiving any form of assistance. So there's also a lack of political willingness and moral courage, basically, from the aid industry and the UN system generally to address the needs on both sides of the conflict.
And could you keep the microphone? So are you in the business of delivering humanitarian aid in Syria?
Yes, actually,
and
yes.
So our friends here want to deliver more. Can you tell us the practical roadblocks to it?
Well, there are a whole series of roadblocks. One, if you want to work in the government-controlled areas, you have to negotiate with Damascus. Damascus will only let very few aid agencies work inside on the government-controlled area, and they will seek to exert very high level of control on all assistance coming in. Secondly, if you want to work in opposition areas, you can come in through the neighbouring countries, but the neighbouring countries today are not facilitating any form of humanitarian assistance. Aid organisations like Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, are tolerated in neighbouring countries, but we're not facilitated. So we have to work in clandestine conditions, crossing the border like journalists on foot, carrying the medical supplies on our backs, working in underground hospitals, in private houses, in farms, in absolutely ridiculous conditions where you can only have a marginal impact. And we've seen in other conflicts the aid system working on both sides of a conflict without the authorization of the government. It's been seen in Sudan, it's been seen in many other countries, but here, the majority of the aid system is only working with the authorization of Damascus, and Damascus is saying quite clearly it's illegal to operate cross-border in opposition-controlled areas.
So when you hear our panel say they would immediately boost humanitarian aid, does it sound naive?
The problem isn't so much one of money. Yes, it does sound a little bit naive. It's a lack of political willingness to actually take the risks of working on both sides and not going through the ordinary official channels.
I mean, I don't know the logistics. Of course it's difficult. I mean, I'm not... But it can be done, and you can, at minimum, you can improve quite significantly the levels that are being provided at the moment, both via Damascus and, as you say, via the neighboring countries. And suddenly Washington putting pressure on Amman and the US putting pressure on Turkey, something could be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the UN agencies are really key to this. I mean, NGOs like us, we can do a lot, we do a lot, and diaspora groups probably do even more. But for really, well, much more, but really to scale up massively as the needs warrant, you need the UN agencies to come in on both sides. And I just want to make it clear, in case anyone here isn't clear about that requires a specific Security Council resolution. So you have to have the Permanent Five agree on that. So when you talk about ramping up humanitarian aid, I'm afraid it requires that level of agreement at the UN, and we're not actively calling for that, but I think you need to be realistic that that's what would be your
Maybe that would be a way in.
And just move can you tell us your name of your organisation before we move on?
We represent Médecins Sans Frontières.
Thank you very much. We're very welcome. Very nice to hear from you. And Firas, what do you think of the suggestion from people who are trying that on the panel you're saying humanitarian aid, or some were, and they're saying it's all controlled by Damascus. So it's like one pictures the air under the wallpaper. They want a resolution from the UN Security Council. Would that be necessary to achieve the goals of... you don't want one. You said it would be necessary. Would it be necessary to get more humanitarian aid? Is a UN response needed?
I honestly don't know enough about the subject to comment.
Okay, and to you, Sharat? Saka, sorry?
Saka. Almost. Well, I totally agree with you on the point that, it's impossible for aid agencies, and I don't think a lot of people understand this, to cross into opposition-held territories from the north, from Turkey, for example, even though the opposition hold those border posts, because, well, the UN can't cross those border posts because it requires permission from Damascus, even though Damascus hasn't got de facto control over that area. So that's a real problem. But I think it's wrong to hint that the UN isn't working in opposition areas, because it is. I think it was the World Food Programme that delivered half of its aid to opposition-controlled areas. Both sides of the front line, civilians on both sides of the front line, deserve and need and require aid equally. And it's important that, the UN continues to work inside Syria,
right,
and regardless of the fact that it has to talk to Bashar al-Assad.
Saka, thank you. And we're going around the room on what the US and UK should do, and we'll move on to regional players. You've got the microphone, sir, yes.
Yes, very quickly, you don't just need a UN Security Council resolution. You could have, of course, Bashar al-Assad allowing the UN, Valerie Amos is asking every day, allowing the UN in, which presumably would also allow a more kind of globalized control of borders that are currently seeing US and UK armored trucks perhaps go across. John Kerry, the US are hosting the US opposition next week in Washington. I wonder what people think as to what could come out of that.
Okay, yes, we're on that section. Can I take is your question related, or shall I take this gentleman's? Yes? Can you store that in your mind? What should come out next week?
Hello, I am from Syria.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I think there should be a directly military intervention, the same way it happened in Mali, without any approval of any Security Council, anything. One day they said, we're going in. Next week, we're done. David Cameron in Algeria taking pictures. The French president is there. Absolutely no problem. Why is it a problem in Syria, the Security Council? I don't understand that.
Wow. What? Okay, you keep the microphone. You keep the microphone. Panel, will you deal with the gentleman's question first? What should happen next week? And then we'll deal with this gentleman. So next week, there's talks. What should happen?
Next week, it's impossible. Nothing will happen because we've come this far, and the international community has been looking for excuses. America blames Russia, Russia blames America, Russia blames someone else. It's not going to happen. Is going to be nothing hopeful, and I don't think anyone is pinning their hopes on that. As for military,
no, we'll come to this gentleman in a minute. On the talks, does anyone on the panel disagree? Does anyone think something big's happening next week?
Sorry, is the talks he's talking about with the opposition? Which opposition that is going to the US you're referring to?
And Idris. Khatib.
Because I'm going there.
You're going there.
Different
opposition. Do you disagree from Saka's point that not much is coming next week? If so, we'll talk about
nothing dramatic, but
right.
No, there are serious moves towards crafting a political solution. I think there is serious diplomatic.
I mean, I think this is all part of, and the Arab League recognized Syria today, the opposition as a seat in the Arab League. I mean, this is all part of a process of trying to empower and recognize the Syrian National Coalition as a legitimate standing body that can transform itself into a representative government and so forth. I have problems with the SNC because I think the Muslim Brotherhood have unfortunately played a very detrimental role. They have zero-sum ambitions, and they don't represent a lot of people on the ground. So we're going to recognize a group that effectively don't speak for a lot of Syrians.
And we're coming to the SNC at the end.
No, he said it. They don't represent the groups that are fighting.
Okay, so will you tell us what would your intervention be? You're the US and the UK. Have you still got the microphone? Would you tell us, for the sake of discussion in the room, what would you do first? Would you have a safety corridor? Would you have a no-fly zone? What would you do?
I'm not an expert in the subject.
You're a Syrian.
I am Syrian, but I'm not a military expert person. I don't know how it's done properly, but the same way they managed to do it with help of I think it was the Air Force's help with the British, and it was on the ground by the French, and they managed to get in, and they did it. So they can do it again.
It's not a computer game. Yeah.
No, it's not a computer game. It's war. I know. I understand.
The way you describe it sounds like a computer game, but I think
No,
it's a waste of time to talk about this option because obviously nobody is prepared to do it. I mean, we can argue for hours why it's not going to work, but there is no point. If you know of a party who's interested in doing this, then let's talk.
No, there is no party that is interested, and that's what I'm saying. They should be interested because he's asking the question what they should do. They should be interested, and they should do so.
I think you raised an important point, which goes back to Sarkar's point before. If you're going to do arms and supporting a struggle on the military front, you need to do it properly. And I think the worst thing you can do at the moment is drip feed arms into this environment where regional players are going to feed their own interests. If the West is going to intervene, it should do it properly and it should do it large. I don't support it. If I was going to support it, I would say one thing you could do, take a risk, put some of your planes over there, and take out their runways. But,
if I may. The issue with the drip of weapons that is going into Syria is intended primarily to make sure that Bashar al-Assad does not actually end up winning this war, which he otherwise would if this drip of weaponry that we're being a bit stiffy about, as you said earlier, were to stop. Secondly, if the Syrian government and the forces of the Alawis were to collapse tomorrow morning, you leave in power people like Jabhat al-Nusra, who would probably advocate, if not the genocide against Christians and the Alawis, then at the very least their ethnic cleansing. I would like to ask again if this is actually the policy course that the gentleman over there supports.
Right, okay. Well, let's break this down a bit. Your question about military intervention, is there anyone in the room who thinks we're going to see military intervention called for by our friend here? I'm not going to call you again just yet. I promise I will call you again. But is anyone new who wants to speak on military? Does anyone else support military intervention in the room? This gentleman, he's polling the views of some of the cleverest people in London. Does anyone think it's going to happen? Would you like to raise your hand if you think it might happen, even if you don't support it? So, I mean, there's your answer from people here. I don't know if you're shocked or...
I'm not shocked. I can't see any Syrian people here. There aren't many.
Right.
If there were, they would be saying the same thing I'm saying. I am in touch with people in Syria. I have been in Syria. I was captured in Syria. And most of the people in Syria want military intervention. 100,000 people died. And lots more will die soon. So 10,000 people will die in a war, but it will finish. They will not continue. But now it's not going to stop without military intervention.
There already is military intervention. You know, we've got the drip feeding that we've been talking about. It's an international arms race, which is the worst case scenario of all.
And that's why you want big diplomacy fast.
Either big diplomacy or a larger militarization, one or the other. But the West has to stop sitting on the fence.
But to answer our friend who's come to get briefed, you're not someone who thinks you back military intervention.
No, because I don't think any kind of military intervention that we've seen to date from either Iran and Russia or from Saudi and Qatar has had the desired effect.
May I ask a question that might help us focus this? What are the core interests of the United Kingdom and the United States in Syria? Why would the governments of these countries actually care?
What's your own answer?
I think that their primary interest is to let this go on for as long as it takes. Yeah. If the two communities in the Middle East, the Sunnis and the Shia, have decided that the only way that they're going to resolve their historical religious differences is by massacring each other, I would understand the position of somebody who was outside this and who said, let them.
Well, I don't think, I mean, to say that they're happy to let it go on for as long as it can, I think is not correct. I mean, there's a lack of ideas. Okay. There's a lack of ability. I don't think it's a proactive desire to just let Arabs kill each other.
Right, this lady on the front, then we'll move on to, it seems to me, very appetite now to regional players. Would you like to contribute now?
Well, just a very quick question. You're saying that the two religious groups are going to be locking horns. Let's look at the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, and there was virtually no intervention, as we all know, from the United Nations or any place. We've all seen and heard and read enough about it. And what has been the resolution after 3 months? Nearly 1 million Tutsis were massacred and sympathetic Hutus, and at the end of the day, we're almost 20 years on since the genocide. The idea of reconciliation and forgiveness and the idea of Hutu and Tutsi living together is essential for the growth and the development of that nation. And it would seem to me, in the most practical world that we live in today, where we can send out drones and we can annihilate anyone, we have all of the technology available to wipe out a nation. The only way forward is for us to actually think about brotherhood, of how are we going to design and be an architect. Let me finish my thought before you interrupt, and then you can jump all over me as much as you'd like or not like. The idea of building, the road to be able to have people get the hate out of their hearts, which is not an easy thing, is for me, not just philosophically, but in practical terms, the only way forward. We can't say that we have to have these separations of different religious groups.
If you wanted to decide which one of these two militant groups would you wipe out, would you wipe out the Alawis, who are exercising ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Sunnis, or the Sunnis or the Sunni jihadis, who are exercising ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Alawis? How would you make that moral choice?
I dispute your zero-sum. This is not a kind of the Alawites want to kill all the Sunnis and the Sunnis want to. I mean, that's a complete distortion of the picture on the ground. Yes, there are some extremist groups, but even Jabhat al-Nusra attracts a lot of support because of the fact that they're well armed, they're well supplied from the Gulf and so forth.
Has anybody from the Syrian National Congress come up and condemn Jabhat al-Nusra? Or did they come out and condemn the United States for saying that Jabhat al-Nusra are terrorists?
They don't dare to.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know.
Exactly.
I know, but they don't represent the Syrian people. When the children of Daraa demonstrated, they didn't even know what is their sect, whether they're Sunni or what.
Okay.
I only knew my sect as Syrian when I was 20-odd years old.
Right, so let's just return to this. It keeps coming back, the question of sectarianism. But we'll move on now just to the regional players now. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Hezbollah, and Russia we've grouped in here. You can blame Millie, who organised the event, for calling Russia a regional power. What is the role of these powers? And we're coming on to sectarianism in Syria in the final section. And to you in the room in a second, the role of people that I've just mentioned. Would you like to start, Rim? Yes, the Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Hezbollah and Russia, what role do they have right now? Or what would you like them to do? You can answer it any way you like, but please don't pause for as long as we had earlier in the meeting.
Okay, I think they all have interests in the region, but their interests are contradictory. So this is why we
well, pick on one that you'd like something to happen with.
Okay, I think Russia wants its Russian flag in there. It's a matter of international pride. They want to say that we push our own agenda, our own solution. The actual leverage they have over the Syrian regime is actually limited. All the talks about the armed deal, I mean, there's only small. This military base in Tartus is really tiny. But for them, it's a matter of them having their they're having their say, their word. If you go back to the first Security Council resolution that they vetoed, actually they agreed on the content. Everybody agreed on the content, but it was a matter of whose resolution is this. So they have to. They have to speak to each other. I think
And
all
also,
of them.
and it's worth linking this up with your earlier remarks. You want them to talk with America.
I want them all to support a solution, not to support a particular party. I don't want to see in Syria a winner and a loser. I don't want Iran and Russia to go and support the regime, and on the other side, the Americans and the UK, they support another party because they're clashing them against each other.
Our friend who
I
said,
want the support of a solution on the table, not somebody around the table.
Dayton for Syria, because he said Balkans on speed. You want a kind of multi-party solution with Russia and America being the big boots that agree it. And to you, would you like to comment?
Well, if you're talking about Dayton, it's a good place to start. You are talking about partition. That or federalism.
No.
That is a possible political solution at the end of this.
But on the regional players, I wasn't trying to introduce that. On the regional players.
From the point of view of the regional players, I mean, their interests are pretty clear. They are interested primarily in defeating the others. The Syrians and, the Saudis and the Qataris see the Iranians as a threat. The Iranians see the Saudis and the Qataris as a threat. They are fighting it out in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. This is one big geopolitical conflict for them that Turkey is getting more and more involved in. And from the point of view of the United States and any maritime power, keeping these land-based powers fighting each other in the region suits them well.
And your comment at the very beginning, you see a global escalation. Do you want to just count to 3 before you predict this? But is this a war coming?
It is a series of localized civil wars rather than Iraq declaring war on Lebanon or anything or something like that. What you're looking at basically is these sectarian fault lines that you've got in the region, like in northern Lebanon, like in some suburbs of Beirut, like in some remaining parts of Baghdad. These are coming more to the fore again. We are seeing in Baghdad an attempt by the Shia community to clear out the Sunnis from the vicinity of strategic assets and strategic areas. We are seeing Hezbollah extending its influence into Syria. We are seeing the weapons networks that is feeding the Syrian opposition extending more and more into Lebanon. These conflicts are becoming one big conflict.
I mean, I completely agree that it's a big proxy war pitting kind of the Saudi Qataris against the Iranians. I think for that reason, there is no military victory, and I don't think intervention, as you were saying, is easy because there are all of these different competing interests, and all of them have very deep stakes and are quite willing to fight to the last Syrian for their broader strategic interests. And so I think until you're willing
dismissing the Syrians as pure agents here.
No, I'm not. But the point is this: that both sides are being supported, financed, aided by backers in the region and more globally. If you cut that off, you don't end the conflict, and there's deep polarization and there's a deep problem. But so long as both sides continue to get that regional support, there is no way of stemming the violence. And let's be clear, this isn't just Hezbollah and Iran. I mean, this is also the Saudis and the Qataris. You know, they're responsible for breaking up a lot of local ceasefires that Annan engineered. This is a big regional mess. And there needs to be, the only way out, so far as I'm concerned, is a consensus that brings them all together and actually somehow dampens their own, the flames that they're fueling. There's no other way.
Do you realistically hope for such a consensus?
I think that yes, eventually you'll get it, as you had it in Lebanon, as you had it in Iraq. Yes. I mean, there will be, the tragedy of Syria is that they will probably fight for several years. It will be fueled by regional powers, and eventually there will be some kind of accord that actually this can't go on, that no one's going to win.
So it is realistic after 15 years.
Sorry?
You compared it to Lebanon, so it is realistic after 15 years, 13 counting from...
What's realistic?
Can I make a point here?
That kind of consensus resolution. The war.
He's saying if you do your long game, it could be nearly 15 years of
Well, I think you need to work for it now.
No, can I say something? There's a dramatic difference between Syria and Lebanon here, is that in Lebanon, there was a very, very strong country surrounding all of Lebanon and keeping the war inside Lebanon only, so there's no spillage across the borders. In Syria, it's not the case. There's so many different countries pulling different sizes, so the conflict in Syria is going to spill more and more, and this is what is going to force them now to stop managing the conflict and head towards resolving the conflict.
Saka, earlier we were asked to consider by Firas what do the US and the UK want. If I just pick on one of these countries, what does Saudi Arabia want? If I could ask the same question and either be allowed to as a gay man or get an answer, what do they want?
Saudi Arabia wants to defeat Iran. It's very simple. They have one goal in Syria, and that is to weaken or defeat or undermine Iran and the channel of arms through to Hezbollah. So and it's an international game. You know, every country that is involved in this has their dirty hands all over Syria. Qatar, Iran, Saudi, Russia, China, the US. They're all involved in this, and none of these parties wants a political solution. So we're in the realms of fantasy talking about this dramatic political solution that's going to appear in the international community. It's not going to happen because they can't agree between themselves where or what the foundation for an agreement or a discussion would be. And furthermore, they can't even agree with themselves what they want. You know, the Saudis and the Qataris are apparently channeling arms into the north and supplying Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamists. And, you know, there have been heavy weapons in the last couple of weeks heading from the south into Dara, heading apparently to the secularists, the so-called secularists. So, you know, they're arming for the future civil war after Bashar al-Assad falls. So, you know, they can't agree in the international community. The protagonists can't agree. They can't even agree between themselves. There's no political solution in the near term.
And they don't want democracy in Syria. That's another.
Of course not.
But we don't help ourselves when Annan does a Geneva meeting, and the two countries that aren't invited are the Saudis and the Iranians. I mean, the two principal backers of the two sides excluded from the key international meeting trying to resolve the conflict. I agree, it's very hard, it's very difficult, it's very unlikely, but we shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you've got to talk to your enemies, and the fact is that when Annan and Lakhdar Brahimi hinted or tried to push in that direction, they were forced back. You know, even when Moaz al-Khatib announced that he was prepared to talk to supporters of Bashar al-Assad or the inner circle, you know, with this incredibly high barrier that he set, which was, you know, the release of all political prisoners and the extension of passports. Even when he put that barrier that high, he was shot down by his own supporters.
And coming to you in the room now on the regional players, but question from me, you mentioned Turkey, Firas, and we're sitting on this stage for a year, listening to 2 years, listening to people well briefed all over London. Time and again, I'm hearing Turkey, in different ways. Turkey is a linchpin. We don't understand what Turkey wants. Would you just tell us, you know, what the prospect for Turkey getting involved in this, the best and the worst?
Davutoglu has made it very clear what he wants. Davutoglu, in his book Strategic Depth, said that the defense of Turkey begins in Chechnya, it begins in Albania, and he regrets that the Turkish Republic did not make a claim on Kirkuk because he thinks that it could have taken it. Turkey is right now a rising imperialist regional power that is trying to extend its control. This is what Turkey wants. It wants to regain its dominance over the Middle East. It wants to open up the Middle East for its products. It wants to gain political control over it. This is why they're swinging towards Islamism. This is why they turned against Bashar al-Assad, even though he was their best friend for a long time.
It's been very restrained. It had an aeroplane shot down 2 months ago, and it was very restrained.
Well, they don't want a war just because they want to. There are other ways to get what you want than war. And the Turks know this and are pursuing this accordingly.
So we're on the question of regional powers. Does anyone new want to speak on the question of where the region is breaking down at the moment? Okay, you can have another go. No, you can't have it. No, the gentleman at the back. Off to you.
Paddy, nobody has mentioned the most crucial state which has its existential interest in what happens in Syria and elsewhere. Only in January, Israel carried out a bombing raid according to Israel, on the border of Syria and Lebanon, according to Damascus, near the Damascus on a security factory. Now, what happens in Syria and how the United States and to a lesser extent United Kingdom will pursue or will orchestrate their policy depends on how the Israelis feel what their security interests are.
Okay.
If they feel that
got it. Stop
they have
that.
already got the Golan Heights annexed.
Stop that. Stop that.
Nobody is going to take them away.
Okay, got it,
from
got it.
Golan Heights.
Stay there, stay there. So that we finally, someone from the audience has mentioned, a very welcome member of the audience, what the Israelis want. You've all ignored it. Is it because I was asking the wrong questions, or you didn't have it top of your list anyway?
Right at the beginning of the revolution, the Syrian army sent out a truck laden with soldiers. They were all standing on the back of this truck, driving along Abu Ramani Street in central Damascus. It was a show of force. They maybe have just been doing a tour of Damascus. They may have been on their way to gun down some protesters. An old woman in the street talked to one of my friends, and she whispered very quietly, because this was still at the time when Syrians were scared to talk openly. She said, "Oh, they're going in the wrong direction. The Golan Heights are that way."
Right.
And the point here is that the Golan Heights has been Israel's quietest border, or at least its quietest occupied territory for the last 40 years, and Israel would dearly love to keep it that way. Of course, Syria is not a friend of Israel, but it's keen to see either Bashar al-Assad continue in power or a weakened Syrian state. They're desperately scared of an independent Syrian foreign policy which represents the will of its people, because that will mean the return of the Golan Heights.
Really? What resources does Syria have that would enable it to challenge Israel anytime in the next 20 years?
I'm not talking about challenging, but the Syrian people want the return of the Golan Heights, and if there is a representative Syrian government, they will either have to follow through on that, or they will have to...
I think Israel's fear is, at least in the immediate short term, is more about Syria developing into an ungovernable space that is home to jihadi-like forces.
Well, that's what it is now, isn't it?
Yes, but the fight is on Assad. I think the Israeli fear is that Assad eventually falls, and at that point you have a state collapse, you have a lack of control, they turn their sights on Israel. But to be honest, the Israelis also want to see Assad gone because of the link to Hezbollah and Iran. So, I think the Israelis at the moment they're building fences on the Golan, they're trying to take out people where they want to. They will be practical in either way. I don't think they necessarily have a preferred choice at the moment. One thing they are saying is don't give the rebels serious weaponry. And this, again, is another reason why the militarization, the Western support for the armed struggle is doomed to failure, because Israeli pressure will ensure that they're never given the weapons that would actually make the difference.
I think Israel wants a weaker Syria, but the one that remains under control. It's not just about the Golan Heights. And I don't know of any country that wants a stronger country on its borders. It's only natural that they wish that it becomes weaker. However, I think it's the how much of this violence and instability inside Syria spill over the border is the red line. So when does this cross the border to Israel? This is why I think internationally, even the two red lines are the stability of the oil region and Israel.
And to you on the regional players, if you'd like to put your BlackBerry down.
Yeah, no, it's breaking news. Syria rebels hold UN Golan team.
Yeah, we know.
Yeah.
20 UN observers detained by 30 armed fighters.
Yeah. And what do you think about that yourself?
Oh,
You're just,
I think it shows you
I don't
how
have an
unlikely.
opinion.
No, thank you for passing it on. And so
I think it shows you how unlikely it is that you will see serious humanitarian aid efforts in Syria. I think it reminds us that the people who killed Sergio de Milo and who blew up the UN building in Iraq are now operating in Syria on the side of the Syrian opposition, and that the Syrian National Council is not even willing to condemn them.
Okay. Would you like to comment on that in your group of? You're welcome to. It's he's saying it makes your job harder.
Yeah, no, I find this a strange link to make with what happened in Herat and Baghdad and the bombing of the ICRC compound, etc. in Baghdad, which.
We can't really hear you, I'm sorry.
Okay. No, I find this a strange link to make, actually. The main difficulties is not the presence of Islamist groups inside of Syria, or radical groups, because we haven't had any problems with them so far. And we're able to work effectively in Afghanistan with a wide variety of groups actually present. The problem is more that Damascus is quite clearly holding the keys to the solution in terms of humanitarian assistance and granting wider access to neutral, independent humanitarian assistance. And the neighboring countries, some of them were mentioned here, clearly don't seem to be interested in having a substantial aid effort coming from their borders into opposition areas for reasons that we don't necessarily fully understand, and therefore everybody's having to operate, or actually hardly anybody is operating, but those who are operating inside are operating in a very clandestine, undercover way.
Because there's two ways in. You either fly into Damascus and head out to the territory, or you fly to the neighbouring regional powers and come in.
You fly into Damascus and then you negotiate for a long time to see where you can help and in which way. And it's rarely a very successful enterprise. Or you come in from neighbouring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, etc. But you have to really make your own way with very little support from neighbouring states, and you have to work in a very low-profile, covert kind of operation. So it makes for a very ineffective, very incomplete humanitarian operation, especially compared to other major humanitarian crises.
Thank you for that. And we'll move on to the question of the SNC, which I've been asking you to delay until now. And there's still going to be time for some closing thoughts from everyone in the room. It's 8:10. We'll end in 20 minutes. The SNC, is it going to be able to bring together a transitional government? Will they have support from opposition groups on the ground? Will it be fully backed by international players? I kept shutting you down on this, Rim. Would you like to start us? We'll go to the panel and then the room on the question of the Syrian National Council and sectarianism in Syria.
Okay. First of all, I think it's, deciding that only one party represents the whole Syrians. I mean, as the international committee chose them as a representative of all the Syrians, is a political interference, and is a repetition of the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. I mean, we had no right to choose our own representative, so now the US and the UK want to choose my representative, and I think the opposition should remain inside Syria. I mean, I can't stress this enough. You can only lead the society from inside. I understand, of course, all the oppression and the pressure in Syria, but it can only work from inside. So I can't give somebody sitting in Cairo or in France or London the right to decide what is going to happen to the people in Damascus.
Will they be able to form a transitional government?
No, they will not be. And also, transitional government, two governments mean two countries, mean divided Syria, and I don't want divided Syria. I don't think they represent most of the people. They represent a good portion of the opposition, and they have control of some of the fighting brigades, but they don't represent everybody. And I want somebody who represents a coalition that represents the people, not just the opposition.
I would answer no to each of your questions. To the point about working from inside, I would bring you again to the incident in which the people, probably the jihadis in Syria, tried to assassinate George Sabra. And this is the opposition.
Who is Sabra?
He's the head of the Syrian National Council, which is the predecessor to the Syrian National Coalition, which had to be formed because the opposition could not agree on anything. The people who are sitting abroad in these opposition councils have little to no influence over the people doing the actual fighting. Negotiating with them is a waste of time. It's good for the hotel business, but aside from that, it really is not much.
I think that they can buy influence, and I think that depends on the West. I think that if the West decides to empower the...
Didn't you just say that if they bought influence, it would last them for around a couple of weeks?
Yeah, hang on, wait a second. I mean, okay. I think that if the West decides to empower the coalition, give them substantial funds, arms, whatever, they can feed that to the country. Yes, they can form a transitional government. Yes, they can gain allegiance out of patronage on the ground. But two things. I mean, I think, unfortunately, the coalition is made up of a lot of very detrimental forces. And I think that, for the future of Syria isn't necessarily a great idea. Secondly, of course, that allegiance and coalescence would collapse the day it finished, and the divisions would re-emerge. But in the short, immediate term, if the West decides to empower them with finance and capabilities, and yes, they can get leverage on the ground.
Doesn't that mean that the civil war, at the end of it, when the coalition collapses, becomes worse?
Oh, of course. But there are two battles here. There's a battle to dislodge Assad, in which there is temporary unity amongst a lot of actors, and there will be the moment after Assad where most Syrians rally together, but there will be groups desiring alternative things.
In the charter of the Syrian National Coalition, there's an item that says no negotiations or dialogue with the regime. Exactly. And the international community keeps saying political solution, which means negotiation and dialogue. So this is where the contradictory is. And in Hague's statements, actually, he said, I welcome the initiative of Mr. Muaz al-Khatib, who were having direct talks, and he put it in the name of the coalition. Said the coalition did, and no, the coalition did not. It's only him, and they're fighting him because he did this.
The Syrian National Coalition is the least bad option that we've got. It's wildly different to the Syrian National Council, which was riven by infighting, controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. Muaz al-Khatib is the leader of the Syrian National Coalition, is a far more popular figure than George Sabra or Barhan Ghalion ever were. It, of course, doesn't represent the entirety of the Syrian population, and that's a shame that it doesn't represent all groups, but it's better than what came before it.
Is
and,
it?
You know, of
Is
course
it really? I mean, the Brotherhood is just as dominant.
Well, the Brotherhood represents a large chunk of the Syrian population.
Muaz Khatib got shot down immediately upon this offer. If you look at Cairo, the coalition last week said, yes, we support Khatib, but we're going to add these principles, these conditions, which basically pulled the carpet.
I would say that represents the Syrian people more than Muaz al-Khatib does, because the Syrian people don't want any kind of negotiation with Bashar al-Assad. The Syrian people are incredibly far.
I disagree. I think a lot of I think they want Assad gone, but there's a lot of Syrians who are tired, who are dying, and there is a broader battle going on. They want victory, absolutely, but they also want to stop dying, and I don't know if there's that commitment to...
I don't think I think there are very few people, at least, who have still got any faith in Bashar al-Assad or any kind of
Nobody
negotiation.
has faith in it. You don't negotiate because you have faith in it.
Well, they
because
don't have
he has
any faith
power.
in his sincerity.
I didn't want him to be in power in first place. He has keys. That's why you have to negotiate
But every
with
time
him.
anyone's gone anywhere close to him to talk to him, he's lied and he's talked
He's
his way
got
out
Russia
of it.
and China in his back,
Of
and
course,
Iran.
and he will still have that.
He feels
and he will still have
powerful.
that. And as for buying the allegiance of the rebels who are fighting on the ground, that's also failed, because the military council, which was formed shortly after the Syrian National Coalition was formed, has failed miserably.
But they won't, my point is they have to be given the money. The military council was not given the money to give arms and weapons.
They have some weapons and they've handed it out, and they're angry that it's used as a form of control. They're angry that the SNC is controlling and picking and choosing its
every time money has been given to the Syrian opposition, every time money has been given through aid to in aid to Jordan to support the Syrians, even in Lebanon, every time this happens, what you see are allegations of corruption, and that the money is being funneled to the wrong people, and that actually the money is not being used properly.
And sorry, you have got another point?
I've got a couple of other points. I would like us to bring up the more interesting question, which is what happens if Bashar al-Assad actually dies tomorrow morning? Or what happens if Bashar al-Assad loses Damascus?
Well, it may be an interesting question, but we'll come to it after mine, which is it possible, let me limp along with mine, is it possible that the coalition does have Sunni and Shia in it, and although you're warning us about sectarianism, at the moment we have a coalition of people against Bashar al-Assad, which does include the people you're telling us are pulling the entire region apart?
Look, from the way that I see it, from the minority's point of view, the more excesses and the more Islamist and openly jihadi the uprising becomes, the more the Christian, Druze and Alawi communities rally behind Bashar al-Assad, as well as some of the Sunnis who don't want these people in power. And to say that Bashar al-Assad has lost all representation within the Alawi community is, in my opinion, the point of view of somebody who doesn't know anything about the Alawi community.
Yeah, that wasn't quite what I was asking. I was just saying that you tell us of a big schism in the region. Does the Syrian National Council coalition have people from both in it?
Yes, it does, but they are not sufficiently representative. The Syrian National Coalition is not relevant to the fighting that is taking place in Syria.
But it's a pretty remarkable organisation if it's got two of these camps, which you're saying is the explanation for the...
The real issue is that it doesn't have it hasn't been successful enough in reaching out to the minorities.
Okay.
I think the Kurds, not the Kurds, well, yes, the Kurds, the Christians, the Druze, the Alawites, I mean, they have been unable to frame
And I said we'd come to your question about what if Assad dies tomorrow, but let's just go around the room. Yes, to you, on the question of the SNC and sectarianism.
Yes, thank you. I mean, isn't it time to have a little bit more transparency about this opposition? For 2 years we've been trying to call to unite the opposition, but actually we have half the opposition is actually pulling against that, the other half of the coalition is actually wanting a political solution. Instead, shouldn't we be more honest about the nature of the opposition and say, well, which ones of you want talks, which ones don't, you know, because at the moment we're having a complete confusion. We have the Muslim Brotherhood is not owning up to its positions. And let's have some transparency from Senator Kerry. He's in Saudi Arabia. He goes there. As we've just said, Saudi funding is going to Jabhat al-Nusra. So why isn't he speaking out against that? Why is there not more? Because that also undermines, the idea of having a coherent opposition. Our allies, who we don't speak out about, are arming these jihadis.
And the question, do you think the SNC could bring a transitional government together? What do you think is the answer?
I agree with the panel. I think it's got very little chance indeed. We haven't even mentioned the Kurds in all of this, who form another large community who are not really present in that. I think it's far more divided. I think we need to have a more honest one, the proper labels, which ones of you want to have political talks, which ones want to have military, and then we'll deal with it.
Can I answer my husband? Or?
Is this your husband? You can't. You can only talk if you disagree with it. Otherwise, we don't know. So we're hearing despair about the role of everybody in this country. Despair about the opposition. Despair about the US and the UK. Despair about Saudi and Russia. And you asked in the middle of this if something happened, an event that Assad dies. Previous panels have said nothing happens. Are you going to tell us anything happens? And then your closing thoughts, everyone, after this.
Not in the least. I think if Assad dies tomorrow, the Alawis will continue fighting. I think that they see this as an existential threat. And I think that this is going to be, I think this conflict is only going to expand. I think you're going to end up in a situation where Aleppo falls in the next month to 3 months. Damascus will not fall anytime in 2013. And this war will continue. And I don't see how people will bash heads together, or what is it that they will do to actually end up with a negotiated settlement.
And do you see it as secularism versus
No, if it was
sectarianism?
secularism versus sectarianism, the Syrian National Council would have spoken out against Jabhat al-Nusra. It clearly isn't.
No, I think the regime will be shaken if he dies tomorrow. At the end of the day, he's an important player. However, the fighting is going to continue, and whoever replaces him will still have the full power. That's my main issue with him. He has full power. So even if we managed to topple him down, as the Syrian people, if somebody else comes and he has still this full power, we still haven't resolved the essence of the problem of this regime. About the Alawite community, I agree that many of the Alawites right now fear for their existence, and we can't say they're wrong to fear. You have to understand they are afraid. You can't say no, you should not be afraid. They have every right to be concerned. So what we need to do, the solution needs to reassure them that it's not directed against them or against any minority in the country. You have to absorb these fears in a way or another. You have to put a solution that you absorb these fears, because the security forces in Syria are mainly Alawite. They're extreme, they're armed, they're fighting for their existence. Even if you get a political solution that tells them they have to do this or that, they're not going to listen to you. They know they're going to fight for their existence.
If you want to allay their fears, why don't you agree to them governing their own regions? Why don't you agree to federalism?
Because they're not, first of all, this is one party's political agenda. I don't want any party political agenda to be imposed over Syria. Political solution means that everybody negotiate and they reach a solution. Second of all, Syria is not polarized like this.
If you were on the negotiating table,
look,
would you
the head of my political group is an Alawite.
Okay.
And of course he doesn't want this. So many Alawites, they don't live in a particular region. Many of them are actually secular. And no, I don't want divided Syria. I mean, it's not even viable.
Well, it's hardly united at the moment, is it?
No, it's not united. We want increased...
The old days.
Listen, there are...
Which ones? The Ottomans, the French?
I think the conflict in Syria, the crisis in Syria, the conflict should continue, but in a peaceful way. It's completely justified. There are Sunni Alawite issues. Let's not deny it. There are Kurdish Arabic issues. This debate has to continue, but it has to turn into something that is less violent, less extreme, less polarized, to build a new Syria. Maybe in this new Syria we'll not have a central state, of course, but let the people decide.
It's not polarized along the lines of Alawi versus Sunni. It's polarized along the lines of I support Bashar, you don't support Bashar. These lines will fade and will change and will reform after Bashar al-Assad does fall.
I agree with you in that more Sunnis who are against the extremism of Jabhat al-Nusra are now turning and siding with Bashar.
This is not about Jabhat al-Nusra. This is about a bigger issue, which is the fact is that who's doing the majority of the killing, the majority of the responsibility according to the UN is Bashar al-Assad. He's killed the majority of Syrians, not Jabhat al-Nusra. And it's disingenuous to put all the blame on them. They're nasty people, of course they are, and they're doing very, very nasty things, and they have horrible ambitions. But, we've got to focus on this. The responsibility lies with Bashar al-Assad.
Don't think for a second that I have any sympathy for
Of
Bashar
course,
al-Assad.
of course, but, I'm just saying
confuse
the
what I'm
focus,
saying with that.
Of course,
please.
but the focus should be on a different place at the moment, because this is where the killing is coming from.
The reason I focus on Jabhat al-Nusra is all three of you are proposing political settlements. And I am telling you that when you have these groups in the country, they are able to act as spoilers and prevent political settlements.
Of course, but they're not as dominant as you make out. You make it out as if the opposition...
They are spoilers.
Of course they're spoilers.
They don't have to be dominant to be a spoiler.
Okay, absolutely.
That's the point.
But
you don't have to be dominant in order to prevent a solution.
But they have a base of support and mobilization. How do you peel that away from them? That is the question. They are there and they are there today. But how tomorrow do you make them...
How do you propose?
I propose that actually that there is a different option, that actually a lot of the Syrians who have joined them, not out of ideological allegiance, but because they're the biggest fighting group, decide that actually there is a way out of this conflict. I think that one way you can stop it is if they're funders.
Rather vague.
If the Gulf, how is that vague?
I don't understand what it is that you're saying in practical terms.
In practical terms. If there is some option of a political solution, an end to the fighting, that will attract people away from them. That will also, hopefully, stop the Qataris and the Saudis funding them, which means they have less leverage. So you weaken them step by step. Going back to a point that you're moving away from that.
This is exactly why we need international consensus around political solution, because only that will dry out the resources of these groups.
You can have closing thoughts in a moment. You finish your point?
No, I was just going to say on Assad, whether he dies tomorrow, I mean, it could be an opening. I mean, it's not inconceivable that, I mean, the Russian position with the US, is, a lot of the dispute has been, does Assad stand for election, does he not? I think you don't know if that could create an opening. I don't think it's black and white that you just continue as it is.
Bashar al-Assad isn't Muammar Gaddafi. Syria is not a one-man state, and if he did fall tomorrow, then the Syrian supporters of Bashar al-Assad would rally around Maher al-Assad, who's even more hard-line. And the fact is that Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, built a state that was bigger than one person, and that was the most intelligent thing he did, because he built longevity, and he built a state that was able to survive with the inner circle in power, not just one person.
Any closing thoughts from in the room? And then the panel, you can have your closing one. You've had one? Anyone new? Yes, you've had one, sir. Anyone new? No? Fine. So with that in mind, we've got just 4 minutes left. The question was, should the international community throw its weight behind the transitional government? Would you answer that? But anything that you were most interested in or infuriated by in your closing remarks, would you like to start us off at the other end, Firas?
Sure thing. My point is this. You have spoilers on the Sunni side that are capable of preventing a solution, and you have spoilers on the Alawi side that are capable of preventing a solution. Once you have that, you are deadlocked. And this is where that conflict is, and it's only going to spread.
Yeah, I don't think they should put their weight behind transitional government. I think they should think about the Syrian crisis in a problem-solving mentality. They have to think that we want to resolve this. We don't want a victory. We want a solution. I can't emphasize this enough. And again, the solution is for everyone. It's not just for one party. I don't see this as a sectarian conflict, but it's increasingly sectarian. I think there is a war that is exploiting the divisions in Syria, the Sunni Alawite issues and all the other issues, just as like the Kurdish one, for example, is being exploited for the sake of international conflict. Or is there something else you want to say?
No more time. Saka al-Makdi, over to you.
I think the idea of a transitional government is a red herring and a distraction, and I think it's something that the international community wants to push because it hasn't got any better ideas. I agree with Reem. It's not a sectarian war. It's a civil war, and it's still a revolution. We must not forget that it's being labelled as a sectarian war because that's the only terms in which the West understands the Arab world. Remember the tricolour maps of Iraq with the Shia at the bottom, the Sunnis in the middle, and the Kurds at the top. It's a similar thing in Syria, except it's a bit more confusing for the West to understand. It's not going to be solved until the international community, the supporters who are arming Syrians, sort their problems out. And I think we have to remember our Syrian friend over here who talked about international intervention. It's very easy for us to sit here in our comfy chairs in London and talk about a political solution, but the Syrians on the inside are the ones who are suffering and the ones who are dying and the ones who we are pushing to continue this war while we come up with an idea which we still haven't come up with.
I'm very pessimistic, unfortunately. I think eventually there will be a political solution, but I think it's some way off. I don't think there is a victory, unfortunately. If it was, I would support military intervention if there was a way forward, but unfortunately I don't. on another note, to end perhaps more positively, I mean, there's been lots of criticism here. I mean, I think it's important to remember that, you know, it's amazing what the Syrian people have done, and kind of one often gets sidetracked by Jabhat al-Nusra or the SNC, or, I mean, essentially they've been let down by everyone. And I think, you know, it's amazing for those of us that know Syria pre this and what's happened now, the way that Syrians have actually come to life politically and civil society and everything. I mean, the country has transformed in a very positive way. And I think, you know, there's huge positives there, and unfortunately they're being let down by everyone else.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. And to you in the audience, we were listening to Julian Barnes-Dacey from the European Council on Foreign Relations, Saka Al-Makadi, award-winning journalist. I'm sorry for calling you Chirac earlier. I think that's someone different altogether,
I've had
isn't
worse.
it? Yes. Yeah. And Dr. Reem Turkmani from Building the Syrian State Movement, and Firas Abi Ali. And to you in the audience, Balkans on Speed, someone speaking up for 1 million people have left your country, and you're reminding us you're from this country and you're still here, listening to all of us going on. And Médecins Sans Frontières, all the work you're doing, you're giving us a briefing as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning, 1 year after the journalists who were trying to cover it, many of whom were friends of this club, died in a shell burst in Homs, saying, please keep talking, please keep coming. So on behalf of all of us in the room, thank you, panel, and thank you to you in the audience. Thank you very much.